I'm standing on the corner of 8th Street and Columbia in New Westminster, BC. It was here on October 1st, 1940, that photographer Claude Dettloff, who stood just below where I am, waited for the British Columbia Regiment to march down that street. Little did he know that the image that he would get that day would galvanize a war effort in the country and become a symbol of loss and hope and service. The image that Claude took that day would be on the cover of the province newspaper in British Columbia the next day. It would also be on the cover of Life magazine. It would be in thousands of newspapers around the world, and it would be in books and every single classroom in British Columbia. And you look and you see the little child, and he hasn't yet got to his father, yet he's left his mother. He's in between, and the mother's reaching out and the father's reaching out. And I often wonder when I look at that picture, what happened to the family? What happened to the father? Did he make it home? What happened to the little boy and the mother during the war? I'm here in British Columbia, and I'm hoping to find all the answers to those questions. Mr. Bernard!
Hi, Lynn. You found me after all these years. Come on in. My name's Canon Warren D. Bernard, a.k.a. Whitey, which has been a nickname that's been following me around ever since the Wait for Me Daddy picture was taken. I live in Tofino, British Columbia, in the most beautiful part of the world. I had white hair until I was well into my 30s. When we moved to the east side of Vancouver, every kid on the block had a nickname, and there was Spider and Rabbit and Fish Cake, and I was Whitey. On my birth certificate, it said my dad was a box maker. And he was quite proficient, evidently, at making apple boxes, cherry crates, peach crates, that sort of thing. He could turn them out into great style. And he was also in the reserve army, in the militia, in the cavalry. And my mom worked in the packing houses, packing fruit and doing all that sort of stuff. Yeah. The war actually started in 1939, and all those that were in the militia and young men that wanted to get into the service sat around in what they called the phony war and waiting to be called up with their militia, the peacetime army. And that didn't happen, so my father got impatient along with a whole lot of other guys, as you can see in that picture, and they went out and joined up in Vancouver, and he joined up with the BC Regiment, the Duke of Connaught's Own Rifles, the Dukes as they're called. And of course, once you join up, you're in. And my mother followed him out to Vancouver. She was rather unhappy about it. She wanted him to wait to be called up in his rank, which in the militia was a regimental sergeant major. She thought if he waited to be called up in rank, he would have gone into the army as a sergeant, and she didn't particularly think it was a good idea to be trying to go through the war on a private's pay. Subsequently, my dad, within 6 months, was an acting sergeant. He was over 30 years old. I think he was 32. And he had a wife and a child. So he wouldn't have been, in fact, nobody was called up. All the guys in that picture and all the Canadian Army were volunteers. And all of the soldiers that served overseas were volunteers. When they did get a form of conscription in, that only allowed them to send them to parts of the empire. Didn't have to go to France. I remember the next day when it was in the province newspaper, and it was a great kerfuffle. It was in the paper, and that was a big deal in those days to have your picture in the paper. I think it's popularity and the fact that it's lasted as long as it's had is because it's absolutely real. There's nothing staged about it. It was a moment in time that happened just like you see it. And I think people relate to the mother, the little boy running after his dad. And it happened, like I say, a moment in time. And photographer Claude Dettloff told me that that was one of the either the only photo he took that day, or the only photo that
He put in.
he put in
Yeah.
that day.
Yeah.
And he said he was trying to line up all the soldiers coming down the road to sort of see how many, because you're looking at about 5-6 city blocks there, and trying to define the soldiers. And he was watching me trying to get over it, and my mom was hanging on to me because there were all sorts of people around there. And when we got down to the bottom of the hill, they were all demobbing, and there's a pipe band playing and people, and my mom was worried that I'd get lost in the shuffle. So that's when she kind of had a grip on me. And my grandfather is just outside of that picture. He was standing beside my mom walking down the hill there, and his son was off to war. So it's just, like I say, a moment in time that was right on. That's what was happening. My dad was going to war. I didn't want him to go. Because of the popularity of the picture, and I mean, it's in the War Museum in Ottawa, and it keeps resurfacing from time to time. And I've always felt that because people relate to it, that, far be it for me to say, oh, well,
Yeah.
so I've always cooperated
Yeah.
with everybody, and I got stacks of letters from people all over the country and from Europe, wanting my autograph or wanting to tell me there is some controversy about who the other guys are in the picture, and I only know what my dad and my Uncle Joe told me about the guys in the picture. They are who they are. They were all volunteers, and they were all soldiers.
Yeah.
And whether they were the actual person in that picture. There's a lot of guys in that picture. My Uncle Joe's in the picture. When the picture came out and they started putting it in all the schools, and then when they enlisted me to go in the victory bond drives, they had a song and dance crew of some very popular Vancouver musicians, singers, and stuff, and they would go around to all the war plants and the shipyards, and they would put on a show for entertainment, and everybody would be there all set up, and I would get up and make a little speech at the end of this, and then the bond salesman would come in and sign everybody up to buy victory bonds, which were the precursor of Canada savings bonds, really. So you would buy a bond, and you got a small interest on that, and people were investing in the country for the war effort. They would introduce me as the "Wait for Me, Daddy Boy," and then they would unveil a huge blow up of the "Wait for Me, Daddy" picture, and then I would give a little speech about I ended it up by saying, and buy a bond today to bring my daddy and all the other boys and girls' daddies home from the war. The one that's on the wall in my house here was never published. It was given to me by Claude Dettloff's daughter after he had passed. And that's the one I have. So that was the happiest day of my life. I was really excited that Dad was coming home because I was having trouble as a little boy. I remember I only saw him once in 5 years, and that was only for an afternoon. He came and got me and took me down to Spencer's department store in Vancouver. And then when Dad come home, well, I couldn't wait to show him off to the kids that I had a dad. And then he didn't come home.
Sadly for Whitey, his parents would never be together again. The stress of his father's decision to volunteer to go overseas in 1940, coupled with her mother raising her son in a strange city, would end their marriage, and they would never be together as a family again.
And the 6th war bond drive, which was done after the war, with my dad with me. He didn't do very well at that, no. Okay, wow. He just got home from the active service. He'd been diagnosed with battle fatigue. He was 35 years old. His marriage was done, and he had a little boy. And when the boys got out of the army, after, he was in for over 5 years, and they gave you a suit of clothes and a pat in the back, and so long it's been good to know you. And you were back out on, as my dad said, Civvy Street, and go get a job.
Right.
So he was not up in the Okanagan where he'd worked prior to the war, so he had to get started in his life all over again on his own. And right. He was pretty shaky, and I met Ruby.
Your wife? How long have you been married?
62 years.
Okay.
Yeah, we met in Tofino.
Mm-hmm.
She came to Tofino in 1961, and I came on January 3rd, 1962, and we met here. She'd seen me before in the Wait For Me Daddy pictures in school.
Was that? So was that
in grade school, yeah. Ruby went worked in Tofino here for 6 months, and then she went off to Europe for 6 months, and then I made a deal with the local doctor here to phone her on her arrival home and talk her into coming back to nurse in Tofino.
That worked.
And it worked. We had 3 kids and various houses we built and whatnot, and then I got into business for myself and went on from having my own business to being a developer and chairman of the board of the Wicken and Ishin and all sorts of good things.
In the course of time, Whitey would finally get what he wanted when he was a little boy. When he was older, Jacques Bernard suffered a stroke, and Whitey and his wife Ruby took him in and took care of him. Later, in 2017, Whitey would catch up with his dad and follow in his footsteps through Europe with a tour with the Royal Canadian Legion.
A Canadian cemetery in France. I am on a Canadian Legion pilgrimage of remembrance from Normandy beaches to Vimy Ridge, encompassing both World War I and World War II sites. I am following in the footsteps of my father, my uncle, my cousins, and both grandfathers. This is an excerpt from my journal of that 14 days in France, Belgium, and Holland, accompanied by my son Steve and my brother Ken. We have just done a Legion Servants of Remembrance, complete with blazers and white shirts, berets and gloves, in a large Canadian cemetery. It's a fine summer day. The cemetery is well cared for, surrounded by fields of grain, potatoes, and sugar beets, the fields of France. In our group are 42 legionnaires from all 10 provinces, and each province has official representation. When you walk around these peaceful places and look at the rows and rows of white headstones, you ask yourself, who were these men? Young, middle-aged, privates and sergeants, officers, and on the stones, sometimes, are etched biblical quotations, First Nation names, occasional Masonic symbols, a Star of David. We are called to Section N, Row 6. A legionnaire gives a history of one particular soldier whose name and rank are on the stone. The legionnaire has researched the name, in some cases from his hometown or branch, maybe World War I, World War II. This part is where a face is put to the name on the stone. Private John Smith, killed in action, August 14th, 1944. Regiment, serial number, 1922, 1944. Always remembered, Mom and Dad. John was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, to John and Lucy Smith. He had 2 brothers and a sister. John was an apprentice auto mechanic. The family lived on 42 A Street. He graduated from high school. His sister still lives in the family home. He was engaged to an English girl named Liz. As you stand there listening to this story and looking at the rows and rows of headstones, the reader is getting choked, and the rest of us aren't far behind. As you feel you knew the soldier. As this process repeats itself, we have lots of time to walk around. You notice in various cemeteries, small plots of graves off to one side. Some are pointed out, others you find on your own. 8 Royal Canadian Navy graves all together. A common grave of sailors, their bodies washed up on the beaches of Holland and reinterred here. A full crew of a Lancaster bomber, RCAF, here. A Spitfire pilot here. And the blank stone with a quote attributed to Rudyard Kipling, a Canadian soldier known only to God. These collective graves are most disturbing, as all the families received was missing in action, and all the grave contains is a piece of someone known only to God, identified by a shoulder flash, a boot, or a button. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them. The years condemn at the going down of the sun and in the morning. We will remember them. It's quiet times in those graveyards, and looking at all those graves and the ages of those young men, it's like,
When you went over there and,
and,
for me, Daddy.
you think
Oh
of your
yeah,
grandchildren.
I tried to
And I got
play it down
great-grandchildren
with the organizers.
It's like,
However, the photo
of the boys coming out of the landing barge, and there's a house on the beach. Okay, well, we had the opportunity to go to that house and meet the family. And of course, someone told the dear little old lady that was still there, I think the daughter of the owner of the house. And the place all decorated with Canadian flags and everything. And that there was somebody here that was famous. Well, if she didn't have that picture, the Wait for Me Daddy picture. And I gave her a coin with a picture on it. And another experience we had, we went to a little town that had a museum in it. And of course we went to this place and they had a little pub there and a restaurant and the museum. And of course, lo and behold, we go in the museum and there's a dusty old picture of the Wait for Me Daddy thing. And it was run by an English couple, actually. And so they, powers to be, told the lady I was the Wait for Me Daddy kid. So anyway, she was just off the wall with this thing. So I gave her a coin.
Whitey was used to seeing his photo on stamps, coins, books, magazines. But in 2014, the city of Westminster invited him back to the scene where he originally broke away from his mother that morning, and he spoke at the unveiling of a bronze statue of the image.
The photo speaks for itself. A moment in time captured forever. The people of Canada, in their appreciation, have given the picture a life of its own. A large copy exists in the War Museum in Ottawa. It has been featured on book covers, in books, in newspapers, magazines, poppy posters, and even a tea caddy sponsored by the Royal Canadian Legion. Over the years, many people, including the media, have contacted me in person or via phone, letter, and now internet, mostly just to talk about the photo or identify with it. The story in the picture is reality. My father went to war. As a non-commissioned officer, Headquarters Squadron, 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, he landed at Juno Beach on or just after D-Day and saw action through France, Belgium, Holland to Germany. Over the 5 years of his service, I only saw him once when he came back on compassionate leave, Christmas 1943. To answer the most asked question, yes, Sergeant Jack Bernard returned safely home in October 1945. The marriage did not survive the war years. My mother, with her independent spirit, struggled to keep me with her during that time. When I see the monument today, it be with some emotion. The photo is the last record of us together as a family. To see that moment captured in bronze as a war memorial will be very meaningful to me. My parents are both gone now, but had she been alive, my mother certainly would have enjoyed all the notoriety. As for my father, I'm not sure of his reaction. It took many years before he even spoke of his war experiences. The second most asked question is what happened to the little boy. Well, apparently he's now cast in bronze. He shares the honor of being on a coin with the Queen. He finds himself on a Canadian postage stamp. Circumstances of the day placed the 5-year-old there. A talented photographer recorded the scene. The real story: I have had an adventurous, exciting, and successful life. My wife Ruby and I just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. I have 4 children and 6 grandchildren. I live in the most beautiful part of BC, Tofino, on the west coast of Vancouver Island. A moment in time 70 few years ago. Subsequent to the photo appearing in the paper, I was drafted, you may say, to assist in the victory bond drives to raise money for the war effort. I pointed to the picture and said, please buy a bond to help bring my daddy home. The organizers referred to me as the boy in service. Well, the 80-year-old boy is still in service. Thank you, you ought to be part of all this. There you go.
I leave Tofino the next morning before dawn for the 6,000-kilometer journey home. As I'm driving, the stories that Whitey had told me are going over and over in my head. And I'm thinking about what an incredible sacrifice the generations before us, specifically for this one in World War II, made. Not only for those that were overseas, for those who were fighting, and the injuries seen and unseen that they came home with, but also for the families at home, the ones that were waiting, not knowing what was going on, yet trying to keep some sense of normalcy in their lives as they were raising a family alone. But specifically for Whitey, a young boy, 5 years old when the picture was taken, 10 years old, and as he put it, the happiest day of his life was when his father came home. But when I think about him and being called out in 1943, 44, and 45 to do the war bonds drive, the young boy brought up on stage with the big picture behind him and him saying to the crowd, holding the hand of an actor, of a soldier, buy war bonds and help bring my daddy home. What an incredible gift of service Whitey did for the country. And for that, he was paid 3 $50 war bonds, which, now knowing Whitey as I know him, it's exactly in his nature. He lent those to his mother so that she could put a down payment on a house so they wouldn't have to live behind storefronts in Vancouver, and they could start to make their way through life. Eventually, Whitey would get a trade, and he moved up to Tofino, and he found the place that he loved. And he also found the person he loved, and he married Ruby, who was a nurse there, and the two of them made their lives there. Whitey got involved, and he started a Little League. He was with the Judo Club, he was with Sea Scouts, and through this he became a volunteer firefighter. He was involved in the Legion, became involved in politics, and eventually he would become the mayor. And Ruby would follow him as well. Ruby would get involved in council as well. He was appointed a lay canon for the Anglican Church, and he was a president of the Royal Canadian Legion there. So I think about that, and I think about what an incredible Canadian that this picture captured when he was 5 years old, and how it was truly an honor to meet him and talk to him and get his story. But one of the things about the story that struck me, Whitey was talking about the first battle, the first big battle that his father was in Normandy, and that was in August 8th, August 15th, which was around the Falaise Gap, where the Canadian and the Polish troops were tasked with closing that gap so that the German army couldn't escape. And as Whitey's telling me the story, my mind is going back, and I'm thinking about a woman that I met in France last summer, and she was standing at a headstone. And I walked up and I was chatting with her, and I asked if she was there to visit anyone. She said, yeah, I'm here to see my father. She told me that her father had died on August 15th in Falaise, and she had never met him. And I think about how these stories about what Canada did for the war effort in World War II, how we're all so connected. But that story is a story for another day.